Good afternoon. We've hit noon here, so we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to today's presentation, Creating Safe and Supportive Workplaces for Transgender and Gender Non-Conforming Employees. My name is Jamie Mayoh-Bauche. I'm an instructional designer here at JSGS. My pronouns are she, her. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event. I'm the moderator today. The Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, or JSGS, is a national hub for advanced research and study in support of public administration policy. We're a partnership between the University of Regina, here in Regina, and the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we've swiftly become one of Canada's leading public policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis-Michif Nation. We have one of our presenters today who will be introducing shortly, joining us as well from Treaty 4. But another one of our presenters, in addition to the territories we're in Saskatchewan, is joining us from Treaty 7. And we'd like to acknowledge that these are the territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and Aihaihei Nakota nations, and the Métis Nation, Region 3, and others who make their home in this region of southern Alberta. We're glad to welcome those of you joining us from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land you reside on and think about and express gratitude for the place and for the people who've safeguarded it throughout time. I've confirmed with Kiersten in Calgary that both in Calgary and here in Saskatchewan, it's a very beautiful day. So I'd also encourage you, I'm going to give you a minute to just reflect on this now, but to find a time today to just spend some time outdoors or looking out the window and reflect more on what you can do to actively engage in reconciliation and honor this land and its people. So we'll just pause briefly right now to do that. If you feel comfortable, we welcome you to share your land acknowledgement through the chat as well, so we can see who's joining us and which lands you're honoring in your acknowledgement. For those of you who are new to the EDI discussion series, I'm pleased to welcome you here today. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the public sector. This series is proudly supported by the Max Bell Foundation, who encourage the development of forward-looking innovations that impact public policies and practices. If you'd like more info on the Max Bell Foundation and their work, you can click on the on the link that Karen is sharing right now in the chat. So I'm very excited to introduce today's discussion. We're going to be focusing on actionable strategies for supporting transgender and gender non-conforming employees, both for organizations that currently have out transgender and non-conforming employees, but also for all employers to prepare to best support current and future gender diverse employees. We're privileged to have two speakers with a significant experience assisting kind of in the broad realm employees and employers and organizations in preparing their overall plans and strategies to support employees, but also in helping individual employees navigate the day-to-day details of gender transition in the workplace. So we'll learn more kind of on both ends of this scale. And so we will also learn more about why and how you as public sector employers and employees can be proactive in making your workplace a comfortable and supportive one for transgender and gender non-conforming staff, and by extension, how this will help you better meet the needs of all your employees. Our speakers will be sharing information today on topics that may trigger or re-stimulate trauma to those who attend today's event. We recognize the need for safety measures to minimize the risk associated with triggering. So if you're experiencing distress As a result of this presentation, please look to Zoom. Karen will be sharing a list of resources there. So we'll start with the logistics here. To help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off your video during the presentation portion of our event. You can feel free to turn all your videos back on for the Q&A. Today's format will be as follows. Following the speaker introductions, which I'll get to next, our speakers will each provide their thoughts on today's topic, followed by a moderated question and answer period to help us to dig into some of the broader aspects of this issue. This will give you, our audience, time to come up with questions for today's speakers, as following the initial portion, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, you're going to send that question to me using Zoom's chat function, so Jamie Mayoh-Bauche, and I will read out your question. This just allows us to get in as many questions as possible. Often there's kind of similar questions that I'm able to group into one. So feel free to submit questions anytime. If there's something burning on your mind right now, you want to pop it in the chat to me, that's great, or you can do it at any time later. If you have logistical questions during today's event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen Jaster-LaForge, my colleague, via Zoom chat, or email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. You'll be able to find Karen's contact information in the chat. Please note that with all of our EDI presentations, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on the JSGS website at a later date. You should have got that pop-up and the startling voice already telling you that it's being recorded. Now that the logistics are out of the way, I'm pleased to introduce to you today's speakers. The first speaker I'll introduce is Kiersten, who's joining us, like I said, from Southern Alberta. Kiersten Mohr is the founder and managing director of Terra Firma Transition Consulting. After a 20-year career in the energy industry, Kiersten's gender transition sparked a passion for advocating workplace authenticity. Moving from a dominant to a non-dominant group while in a corporate leadership role yielded profound insights into enhancing equity and inclusion. This catalyzed Kiersten's pursuit of a bachelor's degree in psychology, a Master of Arts in Counseling Psychology, and the establishment of Terra Firma Transition. Leveraging her education, lived experience, and 2 decades of corporate experience, Kiersten empowers organizations to create inclusive workplaces. In addition, she provides counseling supports for individuals with a passion for trans health and supporting individuals navigating significant life transitions. In her community, Kiersten is a proud executive board member of the Airdrie Pride Society and a vice board chair for Distress Center Calgary. Welcome, Kiersten. We're so happy to have you today. Our second presenter is Trudy Nicolle, who is a Pride Alliance Network ally, senior talent management consultant at the Government of Saskatchewan. Trudy has over 3 decades of experience in the human resources field and has a deep interest in people and their workplace experiences. She's worked as a mediator and conflict resolution trainer for the Manitoba and Saskatchewan governments. And I just have to say, in my experience, I don't know Trudy well, but I'm sure she belongs in this category. People that work as mediators have just a wonderful skill set and contribute so much to the places where they are. She's worked as a senior labor relations officer and most recently at the Public Service Commission as a human resource business partner and senior talent management consultant. Trudy was the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead for the PSC for the past 2 years and is a member of the Government of Saskatchewan's Pride Alliance Network. In her spare time, she is learning American Sign Language. Welcome to you both, and we're so very happy to have you, Trudy, as well. This is going to be a great panel. I'll now get to the heart of today's matter with some moderated questions for our panelists. I'm going to ask the first question to both panelists, but I'll ask Kiersten to start. Please tell us a bit about yourself and your passion for supporting trans and gender non-conforming people in the workplace.
Sure. First of all, yeah, thank you to everyone for logging in, and thank you for having me, and thank you for facilitating this discussion. I think it's incredible to get folks together and have this conversation. For me, I mean, it's obviously very personal to me. I think when I thought about this question, I thought I'll answer it with just a really quick story. But as you shared in my introduction, I was in the energy industry for just shy of 20 years. The first 15 of those I was not out yet. And for those 15 years, we share this story, I had kind of my ear to the ground, just watching and waiting for somebody else to go to prove to me that it was going to be safe and it would work out. In all of that time, I didn't see that happen with anyone else, and I'm certainly not saying nobody else did, but it didn't come across my radar. And for us and for our family, I mean, it was a big, long struggle, a decade plus of working up to that moment. And then when I finally did come out in the workplace, I share all the time that literally within 30 days, I had 13 other people downtown Calgary in the energy industry who were not out, gender diverse folks, kind of reaching out saying, did it work? Are you okay? Is it safe? Were you accepted? All those things. And it was this really big, powerful moment of appreciating and realizing that I was joking that I'm not that special is what is the joke I was making. And we're out there and we're all out there. And it really highlighted and identified kind of that more systemic barrier that was in place for folks to come out. The other half of the story is when I went through my own transition in the workplace, I was in a leadership role. I had over 20 direct reports, and I witnessed kind of the before and after of that, as far as what that did for morale and productivity and connection and that authenticity. It was really a cool experience, and how everybody's kind of workplace facades came down. And really just it ended up being such an opportunity and positive thing for our group and division. So I see all this opportunity. So it's kind of twofold, I think, is why I'm so passionate. Obviously, in the transgender non-conforming space is I want to do everything I can to create space for this, to demystify what it means to be trans in professional spaces, so that there's more room for people to step into that and just be authentic at work. We share, and it'll come up lots today, I'm sure, but I always say I'm an authenticity advocate more than I'm a trans advocate, if that makes sense, because I really believe that's the common thread that weaves us all together, is all of us just want to be able to show up in a very authentic way. That's where all of us will be comfortable. So yeah, that's kind of where my passion comes from. It was a good friend and previous leader that said, you've got all the skill sets to be at the boardroom tables and kind of advocating and doing what you can to create space. So why don't you do it? And so I'm doing it. is how it all started.
Thanks so much. I'll turn to Trudy now and get you to introduce yourself and talk to us about your passion for this work.
Thanks. That's a hard act to follow. That comments. So yeah, I really come at this from an HR perspective, and I'll situate myself today in the conversation. I don't have that lived experience, but I'm certainly somebody who's always been really interested in equity and fairness and social justice, and really building understanding between people. So I come at that work with that lens. And my passion for this particular topic has really been fed with my participation in the Pride Alliance Network and my EDI work for the government of Saskatchewan. And my learning has really come from my experience with that group. And I do a lot of my own reading and a lot of my own research in this area. I participate in seminars. I really take a look at what's happening with the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion and the presentations that they do on this topic, to just keep myself informed, but also be humble about this. Is I'm an ally, and I need to give voice to people's lived experience around these topics. So I'm really interested in the conversation today.
Thanks so much. So the next question I'll give to direct to you, Kiersten, and I'm going to ask you to talk about the importance of building a plan to support trans and gender diverse employees for all workplaces, even those who may not have any trans employees at this point. Just speak to that and to why this may be especially vital in public sector employment situations.
Sure. Then it's going off of kind of my observation of going through it and that appreciation of how many people are out there, and maybe just looking or feeling unsure of their workplace with respect to acceptance and inclusion of their authentic selves. Our biggest advocacy for sure is to do this work proactively. I always share the story in a talk I do. I share the story of my conversation sitting down across the table with the HR person saying, this is who I am and this is what I need to do. And I actually have like a list of all of the uncertainties that I had before I had that conversation: confidentiality, benefits, IT stuff. There was so many uncertainties I had. My belief, and certainly the work we do now, is 95% of those uncertainties can be addressed proactively. And we use this analogy of most workplaces have a path for it, but what we need to be doing right now is illuminating that path, is making it really obvious on how folks can go about it. I think it's probably no surprise, but in the current political climate on this issue, I think it's even more important that we're kind of swinging the pendulum really far in one direction to say, okay, this would be welcomed in our organization. I think it's kind of one of the, the work that we do, one of the services we offer is that if an individual is looking towards transition and they're looking at their employer and they're saying, I don't think it's going to work, what we try to do at Terra Firma is create an intermediate for them so they can come to us. We reach out to the organization, we keep them anonymous until the organization does the policy, the training, and all that kind of stuff. And then when they feel comfortable, they come forward. The reason I'm sharing that is that we have yet to work with an organization who wasn't all in on supporting these individuals. So my advocacy is always like, be proactive about that, is make that clear, because I believe that we've seen cases where, to your point, where organizations don't have anybody. And as soon as that documentation, as soon as that pathway is there, then people start coming forward. So it's really, really important. The language that we use, and there is some research on this, certainly, that it's about kind of like that 70 to 75% of gender diverse professionals are not out, and they don't feel they can be out. So it's a North American study. And just from personal and friend networks and conversations in that space, the way we talk about it is, I would say, in my experience, 9 out of 10 professionals are doing what we call a parachute transition. So they leave a job they love to go through transition. Just that was going to be my plan initially. Go through transition and then try and re-engage in the workplace. And so I think one of the opportunities to fix and improve the unemployment statistics that face this community is just have people not leave jobs they love in the first place. And so I think organizations have a lot of power to make it really obvious and give people the how to do this. The other way that we frame it is a lot around this. When I was doing my master's, and I got really fascinated about the idea of hope. And I think that hope, I used to think, was this cliche thing that we just told each other when we weren't feeling, weren't feeling positive. But really, as many of you probably know, there's a lot of science behind how we create hope, being agency and creating pathway for folks. And so I would say in the world we're in today, I think there are a lot of things stealing hope from this community. And I think organizations can do a lot to actually increase and provide that hope. So as a framework to figure out how to approach it. Yeah, I think that's probably the big thing. Sorry, that the third thing that I had was, by doing it proactively, if we're waiting till someone comes forward to do it, it makes it's still possible. It's more difficult to do without kind of spotlighting that employee, if that makes sense. So we want to create policies, obviously, as organizations, and processes that work for everybody. And it's a much harder process to navigate and to do all that background work without this perception that we're doing this all for this person. Versus we're doing this as an organization for any person that wants to take this journey. So I think, yeah, that's probably the big pieces.
Hey, thank you. So we talked about the motivation in terms of why this is important to do. So Trudy, I'm going to ask you to tell us about the process you were involved in with the Saskatchewan Public Service, creating the gender transition guidelines and the lessons that you draw from that process for other public sector employees and employers, sorry.
Sure, yeah. So the gender transition guidelines, and the subtitle is Supporting Gender and Gender Diverse Employees in the Workplace, was really the brainchild of the Pride Alliance Network. So that idea came from them. They had that vision. Their perspective was, if you build it, they'll come, kind of like Kiersten identified that you need to proactively demonstrate that you're ready for that you're open to that you're welcoming of that. And so that was their perspective. They were really passionate about creating that type of tool. And so they approached the Public Service Commission to say, can we do this more formally? We don't want this to be just a document on the Pride Alliance Network site. We really want this to be a government-wide initiative. So they partnered with us, but they were really the drivers and the kind of the passion. And I know that there's a number of folks from the network on this call today. So I want to really make sure that we're identifying kudos to them, because they really drove the bus. And over a 2-year time period, we drafted sort of the initial draft, and then the guidelines went through the same kind of vetting process that you would for any other policy in executive government. So lots of eyes on it, lots of steps in the process, and took that policy review process very seriously. So we took it out for feedback from our internal stakeholders, and then feedback from external stakeholders like the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. It went through all of the eyes on from legal, from the privacy group, from communications, and then on up to senior leadership before it was completed. So that process was lengthy, but I think that the care and attention to detail is really reflected in the finished product, and we'll have a copy sent out to people at the end of this so you get to see what we're talking about. And particularly, I think the stories that are embedded in the guidelines also really reflect the lived experience of people who transition in the workplace. So it's not just about here's the dotting the I's, crossing the T's, the steps, but what is that like for people, and what is their personal experience of transitioning in the workplace? And that gives a lot of authenticity to the content. So that's sort of a demonstration of employees' commitment or the employer's commitment to gender diverse employees. So it's not enough to just say that we're doing that. You also need to show that you're doing that. And so from my perspective, I think when you've got a document like that, I think the employer can genuinely say, we see you, we support you, and we have a process in place kind of ready to catch you when you're ready. And I think that's a pretty powerful message. So that's kind of for employees, but I think for managers and supervisors, the guidelines also really provide a roadmap, because this can often be kind of deer in the headlights experience for managers. Like, I've got this employee coming to me and I just don't want to say anything stupid or wrong, so help me. And so this gives you a lot of sort of a pathway. It also is a resource toolkit, and it's all in one convenient package. And I think that's really critical too, because for anybody who's transitioned in the workplace, I think there's this deep frustration with, I got to go here, and then I got to go there, and I got to talk to this person, and I got to change this there. And, who do I talk to? How do I do that? And so ensuring that that's clear path, clear roadmap, all the tools that you need. And then the toolkit also includes lots of really great resources, supports for transitioning employees. So it's not just the how, but what else do you need? And what other supports, both at work and in the community? Because typically you're not just transitioning in the workplace, you're also transitioning in your community. So what local resources are available to you? And so, yeah, I think it was just for me, a really profound experience of working with people who'd walked the walk, had been through that process before, and had clear-eyed experiences that they wanted to ensure either did or didn't happen to people coming down that same path after them. But also from an employer perspective, that we were being careful about sort of how we were presenting information and ensuring it was accurate and ensuring that there's all kinds of links in the guide to other resources that are available for both employers and or managers and for employees, so that those are accurate, up to date. So process-wise, just an amazing experience. And working with the Pride Alliance Network, they were an incredible group, which is why I joined them after I finished the work. They are funny, they're engaged, they are passionate about this work. So that was an incredibly positive experience as well.
Great, thanks, Trudy. So I want to, Kiersten, you referenced it before, but I think it's really important that we situate this conversation in the current challenging context for transgender and gender non-conforming people that we're currently in. So as we all know, in the last few years, trans rights have been targeted by the far right, and there's governments, including ours here in Saskatchewan, who have enacted policies that are widely acknowledged to be harmful for trans children. They're also very disheartening for 2S LGBTQ+ public servants and allies and people in different workplaces. And they've also had the effect of emboldening those who are opposed to the integration of trans people and gender non-conforming people into the public life and the workplace generally. So when we were speaking in preparation for this session, Kiersten, you talked about how the importance that you see in directly addressing those people who are voicing that opposition. So individuals that may be indicating that supporting transgender or gender non-conforming people is against their beliefs, and that they shouldn't be expected to do it in the workplace. So can you talk about how you address those types of concerns in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that they gave a lot of thought to this one for sure, because probably to no surprise, I've been in many conversations in the last few months on this topic. And I would say, to answer your first question, I mean, how do you approach it? My approach, and I will acknowledge and validate that as difficult as it is sometimes, I always start with empathy. I start with empathy with respect to that person's perspective or their beliefs or what they're bringing to the conversation. I really try to take that you know, almost like an intersectional, like let me understand where you are with respect to your understanding. I think that one of the challenges, I think, in all EDI work, I don't think this is trans or gender non-conforming issue specific, is this idea that so often in these conversations there's this perception that people are trying to change beliefs, and I take it, I mean, the approach that I take at this work is that beliefs aren't the problem. It's weaponizing beliefs that are the problem, or that is the problem. And I think that what we're trying to do is, certainly in workplaces or schools or whatever that looks like, we're trying to create the space in between where everybody can feel safe and secure, and all of those different things included, have positive mental health, have the resources, the equity that they need to be successful in that space. We can do all of that work without changing anybody's belief, if that makes sense. So I think that oftentimes we got a whole we did a few sessions on this about really trying to understand what resistance is. And in this work, and my belief certainly is, you know, it's bringing in a bit of the human behavior stuff, psychology stuff, is it's very often a fear response. It just looks different. And so if that resistance to, you know, what is different or what is outside my belief is truly a fear response, I never want to meet that with shame and blame or anger, because that just elevates a fear response and it doesn't mitigate. So acknowledging that it is hard at times. I mean, one of the things we always build in into our strategy stuff is whoever's doing the work in your organization, make sure they're supported too, because this is hard work. I think the other kind of reframe we can do is just focus on what we can agree on versus what we don't agree on. So if we think of workplaces, we think of schools, it's kind of those things we talked about. We want, you know, the biggest kind of protective factor for mental health is that connection, is that community, is that safety. So it really isn't about us, it's about all of us, if that makes sense. When we think about this issue specifically with respect to acknowledging pronouns and chosen names in schools. I mean, we've written a whole bunch in the last couple of months of like position statements for organizations. So as an organization, I appreciate as a government organization or public, this is going to be hard to do. But as a private organization, there is all the opportunity in the world to just take an actual public position on these. I think this I don't even call it an issue. It's not. I mean, it's an issue because we're making it an issue. It's, so I'm careful how I use that language. But when we think about kids and youth, what breaks my heart in this is we know the statistics, we know the research, and I started to look at those again last night, and certainly don't have to repeat them all, but we're at the like 4 times greater risk of suicide. Where I think one interesting one to look at is the homeless population, right? Trans youth queer youth make up 4% or 4 to 5% of Canadian youth, and they make up 40% of our homeless population in the country. So it's hugely disproportionate. We know mental health and self-harm, all of those things are significantly elevated in this community because of the challenges they face. There's research that was done in 2021 in Canadian schools that showed that transgender diverse kids are, I think it was like 35% of them are being physically assaulted, and upwards of 60% face constant verbal harassment. And so as a grown-up, sitting back and looking at this legislation, I just have such a hard time understanding why we're choosing to bully these kids as well, or empower the bullying that happens. I think when we think about position statements, or more the fact part of this, I think I've had a lot of conversations with teachers and parents, is that we can base this really, really easily in data, like in empirical stuff. So it's since 2017, gender diversity and identity have been protected things as far as the Canadian human rights. And then if you go another layer into that, what lots of people don't necessarily understand is when Canada signed the UN Rights of the Child in 1991, I mean, it spells out perfectly that we as parents have an obligation to protect the rights and ensure non-discrimination of our kids. So I don't know how we could ever argue, given the empirical research, given the human rights protections that are in place, that this is a good thing for our kids. The last thing I want to say on this is another thing. If you've got folks kind of, not sure where to fit on this, I mean, another really interesting perspective to look like, and I gave a talk on this a few months ago, because I think it's really, I mean, it's sad, but it's interesting. If we look at just historical human rights challenges, or those big ones that we've overcome in our history. So that, ending slavery and the suffragist movement, the gay and lesbian rights, Indigenous rights. What I think is both disappointing but also interesting is the recipe has been exactly the same every time. If you can do your own research, right? So the recipe to challenge human rights has been the same every time. The first thing that comes up every single time is, what about the kids? Ending slavery, we were worried about the kids. When women went into the workplace, we were worried about the kids. When gay and lesbian rights and gay marriage was being advocated for, we were worried about the kids. So we're going to turn everybody gay. We're going to, the reality is we can look back at that and realize none of that happened. It was all just fear mongering and all the things. And I think that gender diversity and the human rights conversations it's the exact same thing we're doing again. All over again. It's the same fight. That knowing that history also is what keeps me optimistic, because we always have landed on the right side of this, as far as human rights go. So I feel confident that I always joke that when all of us get out of the way and our kids are in charge, I don't think this is going to be a thing. But I think for all of us as adults sitting here today, I mean, I was talking with my spouse last night about it. It's that, you know, we're all taught history. We were told we learn history so that we don't repeat it. So let's not repeat it, right? We have an opportunity here to not repeat it and to be stronger and louder and identify some of these obvious truths. So I'm not sure if that answered, but that was my
No, absolutely.
thought.
Those are, yeah, all really strong points in terms of addressing some of those concerns that people might be voicing. So thank you for that. Trudy, I'm going to turn to you and expand upon the answer that Kiersten just shared. So we know that there's numerous reasons when we're having those conversations, types of information, data that we can share with individuals who are hesitant to be accepting of gender diverse folk in the workplace. One of the perspectives that we discussed when we were preparing for this was the benefit of the work that's done in terms of accommodating, preparing for, supporting transgender and non-conforming employees that goes beyond just that group of employees in the workplace. Kiersten talked about her own work team and how her transition impacted that. And we know in many areas of EDI that this is the case. The efforts that we make to accommodate different individuals or different groups of people have a broader impact. So can you talk about that, how you see it, these types of the activity and the work that you did within the public sector, and how that has impacted the PSC and the government of Saskatchewan more generally?
Yeah, I think any equity seeking group, and that includes any of the 2S LGBTQ2 plus group folks in executive government, always feel to some extent potentially it's at risk of their own personal safety, and sometimes decisions that are made have unintended consequences on vulnerable employees. And that can lead to a legitimate fear about, if this is happening, will other protections be eroded? So that's kind of mixed messaging for equity-seeking employees in government. So anything that the employer can do to again, I talked earlier about ensuring that we see you, we support you, we want to have processes in place that recognize the value of diversity in the workplace, the importance of diversity in the workplace, and ensuring that employees who are diverse are comfortable and are given the support that they need to be as effective as they can in the workplace. And I was just, again, I'm going to riff on what Kiersten was talking about. We sometimes say, talk about, this is not about you. It's really about what can you do for your colleagues? How can you be a good ally? So you don't, you think the pronouns is weird. That's not about you. Use them so that other people can use them. And it's not seen as an oddity. When you're talking about diversity in the workplace, or you're talking about the needs of diverse populations in your workplace, it's not about you. It's what can you do to give those populations in our workplace the support, the coverage, the protection that they need in order to feel safe and included in your work environment. So any initiative like this, like the gender transition guidelines, and I think that was why that process was so critical. It's a very upfront and in your face sort of demonstration of we take this seriously and we want to be proactive about this. And this doesn't just rest on the shelf. We continue to promote it, on our SharePoint site. We refer people to it. We talk about it in discussions, not just with Pride Alliance Network, but in other networks with our inclusion community of practice. Like, here's a great resource, and promote it wherever we can, so that it stays really fresh and relevant and continues to demonstrate that we want those employees to, despite what's going on politically, to feel like the employer can, has a safety net for them.
Thank you. So I'm going to pose one last kind of formal question to the two of you before we move on to the Q&A section. I assume we're going to, I would encourage everyone to send me a message with any questions that you would like me to pose for you. And I assume that a number of those are going to be around specific tips for supporting individuals either during transition or just generally in the workplace. But I want to start off with a question that was inspired by an idea that Kiersten raised. And I thought this was very interesting, but both of you have talked about the complexity often of managing a transition in the workplace and all the little kind of nitpicky things that you need to do. So I want to ask the question, name the top 5 things that you see screwed up or missed in management of a workplace transition so that we can start to flag those for people if they're working to manage or support a transition. What are some of those things that aren't necessarily the first things that are popping up or the things that maybe come to the forefront right away? Go ahead, Kiersten.
You want me to just say? I can start. So for sure, I've got a strong number 1 and then 4 others. So my strong number 1, and I'm saying it 3 times with intention, but is confidentiality, confidentiality, confidentiality. And so I want to really bring to light that from that moment an individual discloses to whoever they disclose to first, to that point when they're actually out in the workplace, is an incredibly stressful time for many individuals. And what the mistake that we see get made, and I say mistake, but I'll also say it's never intentional. It is very much people wanting to not screw up, or to Trudy's point earlier, wanting to do this the right way or support someone the best they can. Is that somebody comes out to you as another employee, and right away you're going to HR or your boss, you're saying, okay, this person just, how do I do this? Each of those conversations, you're outing that person, which we don't want to do. And as soon as someone, then they get an email or phone call from someone else saying, oh man, I just heard, like, regardless of whether it's positive or negative for that person, now they have no idea who else knows that this is going on. So one thing we build into the process and transition process is coming from, again, the counseling world, is we build an actual informed consent process. So if someone comes to me and I say, okay, well, I'm going to need to get IT involved to do your credential and your name changes and all that kind of stuff in the system, I would approach that person. I would tell them who I was talking to, what I needed to talk to them for, and we have like a sign-off kind of process. And in that process, we always give the individual the opportunity to self-disclose first, versus me sharing. And some people want to do that, and some people say, no, you go ahead and have the conversation. But what it does is just create that trust as the transition team kind of slowly builds for that person. They know every single day in that in between who knows and who doesn't. I think that is incredibly important. We've talked about just proactively developing the process. Trudy, it sounds like an amazing process you went through. I love the combination of the perspectives that were part of that. I think that's beautiful. One of the things I would say on process documents is ensuring that you're using a very like trauma-informed lens when you're building it. So a good example of that is some mistakes we see, and they're not mistakes, some challenges we see in process documents that organizations have done is if it's really prescriptive, like you need to go to your HR business partner and then they need to go to your leader. So when we think about a trauma-informed approach to this, what we advocate for is giving that person complete agency in who they disclose to first. Maybe they need to disclose to an HR person in a different department than it isn't their business partner, or a different leader. And I can tell you that in all the people that we've worked with through the process, when we think of their direct leader's involvement, I would say honestly 7 out of 10 times they don't want their direct leader to know until the very end. So I can tell you it is very, very possible. Trudy, you said it beautifully. It's like, as a leader, you just need to set your ego aside a little bit and realize this isn't about you. And what we do in that process is that we'll work with whoever their transition team, like whatever that looks like for them as far as comfort. And then if the leader's not in the loop, the leader can prepare everything they need to prepare without knowing a name, if that makes sense. And so what we do is the night before or the morning of the announcement, we meet with the leader and we say, okay, this is who it is, and then we go. And they're finding out kind of the same time everyone else. So it just gives that person agency and who knows what their transition team looks like and how the process is going to unfold, which I think is incredibly important. The policies and procedures, I always share the story that when I sat down with my HR person, I had almost every corporate, like our policies or anti-harassment, I had them all in my hand, black lined out and edited to say, here's all the changes you need to make. So this is a good chunk of work we can do ahead of time. Working with lots of individuals going through it, I promise you, I have not met anyone yet who hasn't done this before they come forward, is kind of going through harassment policies and things. And really at the end of the day, making sure that we're specifically talking about gender identity and gender expression as far as protected grounds in the organization. They are obviously at a Canadian human rights level, but making that really clear in your own organizational policies is really important. The last number I saw is only about half of Fortune 500 companies in North America's internal policies meet or are congruent with the human rights policies that or protected human rights that are currently in place. The fourth one is the washroom thing. I always joke with all the years and experience in education, the amount of time I spend talking about washrooms would boggle your mind, I'm sure. What I wanted to say about washrooms is one common, and again, best intentions in the world, but one common mistake or a couple things we see on washrooms is washrooms are not like what I'll say right off the bat. It's not something you can sit on the fence on. So when we work with organizations, we say you have to make this very, very clear. In Canada, we're quite fortunate in that washroom, from a legality perspective, individuals can use the washroom that's congruent with their gender identity, full stop, essentially in our country. And so the way that we frame that in our process or policy work is really as an organization, you follow that is as far as individuals using whatever restrooms comfortable or congruent with their gender identity. And then we have just a piece where if people are uncomfortable with that, then the organization has a commitment to provide that person with an alternative, not the trans or gender non-conforming individual. A really good, and I'll share it because I'll never forget it. I was doing a gender diversity training, and it was a leader in an organization, and we were talking about the washroom stuff. And I was commenting on because they had put in gender neutral washrooms, and so they said, we're already ready for this. We have a washroom for this person to use. And then a very senior person in the organization stood up and we were talking about. I was making the point that if you have a gender neutral washroom, that doesn't mean that trans people have to use that washroom. And this individual stood up and he just connected it to like segregation. He's like, if we're telling somebody that they need to use a certain washroom based on who they are and how they look, he's like, that's going way back to a place we don't want to go to. So I throw that in as a bit of an analogy because I think it's a powerful one. Washrooms, without a doubt, are the biggest inclusion inhibitor, I think, in organizations for transgender non-conforming folks. You can't exist in a space if you can't use the washroom. So it's a big thing. And then the last thing is to put, equal or as much effort into supporting the people around that transitioning individual. As far as, it wasn't even part of the consulting work that we foresaw would even be, or that I foresaw would even be a big piece. But as far as like leader coaching or employee coaching or whatever that looks like, so folks that maybe aren't on board or have questions with respect to supporting this individual, my belief is we need to give them as much time as the individual. And I think that going back to that earlier conversation about getting to like, what is that underlying fear with respect to this person using a washroom or in the space or whatever. And we see over and over again is that if you treat that conversation with some empathy and compassion, most people get there. Like most people get there with respect to acceptance. I think what we try and avoid is that very divisive, right? We will never solve anything in that divisive space. So the more that we can pull people together and create safety for a conversation, I think that's where change happens. So those are my 5.
Thanks very much. Trudy, go ahead.
I'm so glad again that Kiersten went first, because I'm just going to riff on some of the things that she talked about. So very similar. My first one was an employee-driven process, but make sure that you have a process. And I think that's just been so important for us as an employer, that we've got, kind of a clear idea. We've got lots of tools that are available, resources for managers and employees, guidelines, supports in place, precisely as Kiersten talked about, that it's not just about that employee, but what else can we do to support that manager who's supporting that employee, so that you've got the best possible outcomes. This I'm going to be more technical maybe about what the employer can do, but one of the things that was certainly identified when we were creating the guidelines was a look at accelerating or prioritizing IT processes when there's change, so that things like your name tags and your name change across all platforms, your email, your Teams, your ID badges, mailing lists, databases, employee records, that those get prioritized in terms of change. Because often there's a 3-4 month IT wait for a name change. And maybe if you're getting married and you're, moving to a married name, that's okay. But to keep having your dead name appear, in a Teams meeting or something like that is pretty re-traumatizing for employees. So rather than just putting them in the queue, identify that they have a priority and you've got a go live date and those changes should occur. And if there's ways of ensuring that legacy documents or whatever don't continue to use that dead name, I think that's a really important thing to wrap your head around as the employer. I'm a big believer in additional training, and not necessarily training, but just exposure to these topics. So as many conversations and presentations and topics that you can have on this, on 2S LGBTQ2+ topics. It just exposes people, normalizes the conversation, makes it easier for people to talk about maybe the tougher things, because you've just been having very general conversations about this in presentations. I also think the conversation about allyship is really critical. And again, riffing on what we've already talked about, it's not about you. How do you be a good ally? How do you ensure that you're not making it more difficult for transitioning employees? I think this is from an IT or equity, diversity, and inclusion perspective, making sure as the employer that you have meaningful support for all of your employee networks. So what kind of corporate championship do you have for your equity seeking groups? What kind of funding are you giving your employee networks? What kind of skin in the game do you have as the employer? I think that's a really critical messaging tool around not just, we're saying that we support you, but we actually do both financially and corporately support the work that you're doing in your employee network. And then just some small things I think are really critical, like the use of pronouns, or posting your safe spaces poster, having a pride flag up. And that starts to generate a culture of inclusivity where that's not just performative, it's normative. And so we just do those things. We do a land acknowledgement. We use pronouns. We do those things as a way of demonstrating that we have a serious commitment as the employer to all equity seeking groups in the organization. And that's to ensure that all employees feel included, welcome, feel like they belong.
All right, thank you so much. This is the chance now where we're going to turn towards the audience Q&A, and I do have a number of questions that have come in, so I'm going to get started with those. But I will remind individuals that if you want to message me and send a question, I will try and get that in the time that we have left here. So the first one from Ruben says, a very interesting discussion, and it's for you, Trudy. So Ruben is asking, after the process of creating the guidelines, was their impact measured in any way? Were transgender employees consulted to verify if they felt safer? What's the work going forward around the outcomes of those guidelines?
That is always ongoing, and we don't, it's a difficult thing to measure. One of the changes that we made in the last round of our culture survey was to have employees identify if they were non-binary. So you could choose your gender, and there was a non-binary option. And then we did some analysis of the feedback from that group in comparison to our other equity-seeking groups across government. And that, you know, there's some concerning feedback there about did those employees feel safe? Did they feel like they were given equal opportunity? Did they feel like they had the support of their supervisor? Those kinds of questions. And so that starts to inform the kind of either policy changes or the type of work that we want to do to you know, start to peel out some of the why of that. So no formal measurement, but as I said, we try to keep those guidelines, our network, the inclusion work sort of front and center, so that it never falls off people's radar.
Thank you. And the next question here is for Kiersten from Joella. They said, we really appreciated your comments about authenticity. So the question is, how do we encourage authenticity in the workplace so that all employees, including those who are considering coming out, feel welcomed for who they are?
Yeah, I think that I think it's going, I mean, again, kind of off Trudy's comment as well. I think that it is the more that we can do about, or more we can do in organizations to, you know, we talked about training. One of the powerful things I think we need to do more of, and there's lots of science why this is so impactful, is the storytelling piece, right? It's going back to what I said at the beginning. It's like the more that we can like drop facades, the more we see the connection between us instead of the differences between us. And so organizations prioritizing experiences like that, where we sit and learn about experiences. When I share our family stories, we've got a talk that I do, just more personal talk, and one of the things I share in that was an experience from an HR person at the organization that I was at. When I went through everything, and it was the moment that I realized, I always start the talk by saying that none of the challenge was about being trans. It was about that challenge of being authentic, and that I think is really relevant to so many people. I kind of use this theme of like, we're all in transition. We're always in transition towards a more authentic kind of version of ourselves. And one of the examples I used was this woman sent me an email, and I've got her permission to share it. And it was, started by celebrating I'm so happy for you, and this is amazing. And then she shared her whole story about being in an abusive marriage, and not feeling that she could go or leave with her child, and all this kind of stuff. And all of the reasons she listed in this email for why she couldn't make this change were the same things I was telling myself, completely different context completely. And then at the end of the email, she said, and then today I heard your story, I read your letter, and I thought, if you can do it, I can do it. And then she left this really terrible situation. And so I think that authenticity theme is, in all EDI work, is what we grab onto. I think the world gets real easy if we just focus on that instead of what authenticity looks like. Right, there's all this judgment and this is right, this is wrong, as far as authentic identities, versus let's just celebrate the process of it. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer, but I think that the storytelling thing, I think, is huge to encourage that. If you see someone, on a senior level in your leadership stand up and share a very personal story about whatever it is, it empowers that in an organization. And, you know, as a leader, after I went through it, I mean, just what changed in conversations with people was so like such a night and day difference. You know, I always joke that I thought I was so naive before, thinking I was this safe, inclusive leader who people would share anything and everything with me. And then I went through and I had this, you know, no choice but to be vulnerable as far as getting through what I needed to get through. But that actually opened this door with so many people to then just change the conversation. And so there's so much, I always say it's the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity in a workplace. If we get to that point where people truly come to work in an authentic way, it becomes very, very empowering and amazing.
And the next question may relate in some way. It's asking from David, what are some key tips specific to middle managers who have a little control over organizational policy, but lots of impact on daily lived experiences? So it's not necessarily around making the kind of bigger institutional decisions, but about supporting those staff teams. Did you want to speak to that, Kiersten, and then we'll turn it over to Trudy?
Yeah, I mean, I think my quickest response to that would be, you know, really leaning on kind of inclusive leadership traits, right? As far as what specific leaders can do. I mean, there's lots of training, there's lots of, again, science on what it takes to be an inclusive leader, the vulnerability, cultural humility, that willingness to ask questions and listen more than we talk, all those things. We won't get into a lot of detail. The other thing I would say as a middle manager is all of us have the opportunity to advocate in our organization, to go up and say, you know what, I think this needs to be in place. It's the way I always frame kind of the privilege thing. And I say that very cautiously. One of the themes we talk about in the training we do is I think that word has been weaponized. You know, as I say, never add a D to the word privilege. Never call somebody privileged. The reality is all of us have some degree of privilege, and understanding our privilege is really the goal. And I think as a middle manager, you have more privilege than the people that you are reporting into you. And so one way you can use that is be an advocate to say, you know, up to your leaders to say, hey, we need to develop this, or we need to do more training on this. To Trudy's point, just to get the conversation happening in workplaces.
Trudy.
I'd say a very similar thing. Never underestimate the power of just showing up. So when we have, for example, senior leaders who come out and walk in the Pride Parade, that's a hugely powerful message. When we have senior leaders who are joining in on conversations like this, or presentations like this, or champion sort of diversity work in their own ministry, and show up for events and show up or encourage people to participate, support their employee networks, talk about their employee networks, post a pride flag or a safe spaces poster in their own office. That really resonates with employees who are like, oh, look at that guy, or look at that, you know, woman who's got demonstrating that in a really powerful way. So it's just even very small things like that. The use of your pronouns in your signature, again, small thing, but powerful impact.
Okay, and I'm going to just link this to another question that came in from Sadia. So Sadia was asking if your organization does not have a formal plans or policies, where should a manager, or where should somebody that's looking to go to create those policies start? And specifically, she's asking, are there organizations in Saskatchewan that would do similar work to what yours does, Kiersten? I know Trudy has shared with us the guidelines. So Karen has said, if you like a copy of the Government of Saskatchewan guidelines, that has some resources listed in there. So that might be a place to start. But also, is there somewhere in Saskatchewan, Trudy, that you're aware of that would help with those types of supports?
Not that I'm aware of, but certainly when these were developed, we did an interjurisdictional look at what other provinces, what other territories were doing, and lots of other organizations and provinces have developed a similar tool. We used Nova Scotia's guidelines as sort of a template for what we could do here in Saskatchewan. So I'd encourage you to take a look at organizations that already have one and what theirs looks like. And I know because we partnered with the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission on the development of these gender transition guidelines, they actually provide a copy of our guidelines to other organizations who are looking to do something similar or build something similar. So once you have that template, you can tailor it to your organization's need potentially. I would really encourage you speaking to people who have some expertise or lived experience as well, because it's hard to do this kind of in isolation without that feedback from people who've actually walked the walk. And I think that's a really critical element of the development of any kind of policy or template like the transition guidelines that we use.
Perfect. Thank you. Kiersten?
Yeah, I'd add, I'd want to acknowledge, the approach that Trudy took. I think with respect to developing the ones that you have, I think is beautiful. I think there's many different mechanisms to get there. But Trudy, you just building on what you said or reinforce what you said, I think it's important to make sure your reviewers should be folks from the community. They're going to be able to pull out kind of the intricacies in process stuff. I think as far as organizations, I don't know any in Saskatchewan. I know there's a few in Canada, and certainly I think I know of us, Trans Focus, the 519 in Ontario, and a lot of those are not confined to just working in a province. We've done them from Vancouver. The most challenging one we did was in Texas. Actually, it was a company in the Gulf of Mexico. So yeah, I think there's lots of precedent out there. What was I going to say? My feedback would be just don't worry about perfect. Just start the work. And I'm always such a fan and a huge supporter when, to Trudy's point, when organizations take it upon themselves, when they give it to somebody in the organization to do and to work on, and then review it perhaps with an external person or an external group, just as far as that lived experience piece. But the more that organizations I think with any EDI work, the more they're doing the work themselves, the more, in my gut, the more that's guaranteeing some sustainability in that work, because there is that ownership versus a consultant, report that comes in and sits on the shelf and it's there when you need it. I think you want to generate and cultivate that really personal connection and allyship in the work, because that's what creates safety for folks to come forward.
So the next question comes from Carter, and Carter just indicated that they may have missed a little bit, and they're not trying to be political or give anyone a hard time, but is just curious about what the organizational dynamics at the government of Saskatchewan are like, noting that there's many impacts in terms of equity and inclusion, but then the conflict that we had mentioned earlier with the current legislation from the government of Saskatchewan. So Trudy had addressed that kind of initially in one of the questions, but Carter's asking, is there some dissonance that can be explained? I'm really just curious, again, not trying to challenge. So is there any piece that you want to speak to there, Trudy?
Yeah, this is a tricky wicket for somebody who works for government to talk about kind of legislation and this has happened all the way through my career, that lots of decisions get made that I don't necessarily agree with, but the government of Saskatchewan is my employer, so I want to be careful. But having said that, I know that there's significant impact for people in the LGBTQ2+ community, trans community. When decisions like that get made, it really impacts people's sort of sense of safety and well-being. And if the government is making those kinds of decisions externally, what else are they going to change their mind about? So, the protections that I already have, are those going to be eroded in some way? And those are real. And that's a hard thing for employees to live through. And I don't have good ways to reassure people or to sort of say, oh, don't worry about those kinds of things. I think that would be disingenuous. But to create space for people to talk about that, create space for people to talk about what are our supports when you're feeling that kind of anxiety, and what is the employer's commitment. And I know that this employer, again, has had high-level conversations with people in the Pride Alliance network about what they can do to ensure that they, again, feel safe, feel heard, feel seen. And that doesn't necessarily alleviate all those concerns, but they take the concerns seriously and genuinely.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for the question. Here we've got one more specifically.
Jamie,
oh, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Kiersten.
Just a really quick point, because Trudy, I love what you said. I think there's some element of this that at the current time is probably just out of the decisions made. It's there. But I know from on a counseling side is what I see. Like, I think validating what it is for folks is really important in this time. I mean, essentially what is happening, if you're working for the government of Saskatchewan, this legislation's coming out, it's creating a moral injury at the end of the day, right? You're working for an employer who's got a rule or a policy that's really incongruent with who you are, your own belief system. And I think making sure we're validating that for people and acknowledging that injury is there is really important in this interim kind of period. So that's all I wanted to say. I just think that what we can do is just really validate. And I heard Trudy do that. It's like, yeah, this is hard. This is a thing. This is hurting people in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So in terms of the hiring process, Andrea's asking, is there any information an employer should be including in a job postings, the organization's website, et cetera, to let folks know they're working toward being inclusive workspace for 2S LGBTQIA plus applicants? So is there flags that they can kind of put up to say this is a safe place to be working, to applying to and working at? Trudy, did you want to start?
Yeah. Or sorry, yeah.
No, that's okay. I was just trying to mix it up this time. Now I'm just confusing everybody.
That's an interesting question, because the government of Saskatchewan uses 4 equity categories in its diversity staffing, and 2S LGBTQ+ is not one of those categories. So we don't specify that. I think we certainly have lots of conversations in the EDI space about how do you be inclusive of that equity seeking group, or any equity seeking group, frankly, but that's a protected group under Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission groups of protected employees, but it's not a diversity group for diversity hiring. So,
okay, Kiersten.
Sorry, I muted. I was just going to say there are lots of, like, when you're building out your process and your organizational kind of policy stuff around gender diversity, there are a ton of considerations on the recruitment side. When we think of, the one that pops to my head right away is the name part of it, right? If somebody's transcripts are under an old name, and what we really want to do is try everything we can to set up that recruitment process to make sure that person doesn't have to keep outing themselves throughout the process. So the solutions to that look different in every organization, but it's certainly a consideration. Your point and the way you frame that question around, like the website and the information we put out, I think it's really important. I think that there's a lot of work and resources. So, I mean, greater EDI conversation, but on just the job posting. I think that so many organizations with recruitment, they get focused on how to do inclusive interviewing and equitable interviews, but the job posting like that how we're attracting our pool of applicants in the first place is probably your biggest barrier as far as diverse candidates. So we've leveraged some research, and there's a tool that you can actually put your job posting in, and it tells you how gendered one way or the other that job posting is. And you can kind of modify and work with it to make it a more gender neutral job posting. So there's all these things that we can do. And then to your point, having it very obvious on websites and kind of external facing information for the organization that you are inclusive. By far the best thing you can do, and I get it's harder as a government body, but if you're a private company, is the more you're visible on social issues, on the LinkedIns or whatever, is a huge thing. When I see organizations who put out a statement on the Saskatchewan decision or trans inclusion or gender diversity, it's to me it's a big step to do that as an organization.
Yeah, I think we've also had conversations with Pride Alliance Network about if I see a business with a pride flag on the door, or if I see their social media has any indication of alliance with pride, that's another indication to me that it's a safe safe organization, or an organization that's at least thinking about these topics.
Hey, the next question actually drills down a little bit more into the topic of self-declaration forms. So Kim is wondering, is there a way to kind of frame or use self-declaration forms using around the language or the way that they're framed, so employees feel comfortable sharing as a new hire? And I'm just curious, actually, a little bit. A self-declaration form is like, it's a piece of paper. You're probably filling out a lot of things right off the bat. So I'm wondering if there's also kind of pieces around that and how they're given and how the whole intake process is that may make the form something that is, or make the person more comfortable with self-identification.
It's the conversation that we've been having for a long time in government. So we have kind of a dual process. We have sort of our staffing process where you can do some self-declaration, but we also have another process where you can simply self-declare as one of the equity seeking groups when you're hired, after you're hired as well. So competitive process, HR process. So certainly there's that piece, but we've also really been working hard at ensuring that all of our forms are, if they can be gender neutral, they are. Like, do you actually need to know my gender on this form? And if we can take it off, let's take it off. Or if you're going to be asking me for my gender because it's important, for whatever process you're using, that I'm given more than a binary option. And so can we have a non-binary option, or many options, or a text box, or ways of saying I don't want to self-declare if I don't have to, rather than forcing people into sort of this or that. And so that's a work in progress, certainly.
Kiersten?
Yeah, that sounds great. Like I think what I would add is to build on Trudy, I love what you said about it's like being really conscious of asking ourselves the question of why we need to know. If we're not using it for anything, we shouldn't be collecting it. Just kind of it's that simple. I think that so many places have just downloaded templates or whatever, and they just go with that in softwares without much thought. I love the idea, again, building on you about instead of a whole bunch of options, just letting people self-disclose what they identify or how they identify. I think one of the challenges when we do survey design for EDI surveys, like one of the other things to be conscious of is, and again, this is a bigger EDI topic than just trans and gender diverse folks, but is that the other thing, right? To Trudy's point, is very often we'll have male, female, and other, and we'll have English, French, other. Well, if you're somebody, use kind of an intersectional lens in that design, it's like there's going to be people who have to go through that entire thing clicking other. So when you go through that entire thing clicking other, you obviously feel a little bit othered by the end of that process. And so I think with respect to where technology is and all the things like AI, all the tools at our disposal nowadays, I just don't think there's much there's much justification to make it very binary anymore. I think we can create that optionality. I think the other thing with forms, the thing that we see lots and try and advocate for lots, is that transitional space around this conversation around when we use the language of preferred name or preferred pronouns. So we advocate very strongly not to use preferred. That it gets interpreted by too many people as it's an option. And so, being more frank and specific about that, and just saying, either just saying name and then differentiating that from a legal name, I think is one way to do it, or chosen name versus legal name, or something like that. So it's there's so many things you can do just to make that process a bit more inclusive. But I think to Trudy's point is just be critical about the forums you're doing in every way, and appreciate that lots of them are coming from very historic ways. And because there's a big captive audience, also do it in the public. Like, do it at, we have so many fun stories with our family, and my daughter, my whatever. It's like, you go to the chiropractor, you go to the optometrist, you go to and I don't mean be a jerk. I just mean, when you fill out the intake form and they're saying like, what's your sex? And it's like, what does that have to do with checking my eyes, right? Like, you don't need, and every time we challenge that in the community, very empathetically and respectfully and kindly, it's like the response 99% of the time is, we've just always done it like that. And so again, it's the way that we can all use our privilege in the community to just say, because if we're challenging it, that means somebody in the community doesn't have to, and they don't have to out themselves to get their eyes checked, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's interesting, and I think I know within the public sector we have healthcare organizations and healthcare workers as well. So there are all kinds of different issues with forms and language that we'll see, where sometimes gender or sex can be relevant and sometimes it isn't, but the language that we use around that can be really important as well. So I'll give people one more minute. We only have kind of 5 or so minutes left here before we're going to begin wrapping up. So if people want to get a last minute question into me, that would be great. And then I'm going to just pose a question here just for a quick response. So the last question I'm going to pose is, how would you direct either an individual or a support person, colleague of an individual who has gone to their employer around transitioning or around coming out and not had a positive response? What would be the next steps for that person, if either in supporting somebody in that position or for themselves, if they're not met with a positive, constructive response? Trudy?
Well, I'd be curious about what was going on there, and I'm going to put my mediator hat on for a second. I think kind of wondering about that experience and why that happened. And it might be that whoever you went to didn't feel prepared or comfortable, or kind of freaked out on you a little bit, or what that looked like. And if so, then who else can we kind of ensure that you get to talk to continue that conversation, but maybe in a more supported way. But I'm also compassionate about being on the receiving end of that as well, because I think sometimes a reaction that we perceive as being negative is just sort of like, I'm freaked out because I don't know what to do and I don't want to say anything or do anything wrong or stupid. So kind of slow walking that a little bit and making sure we've got good information. And if that first try, and I think that's a little bit of what Kiersten was talking about in terms of experience. Do I even want to take another crack at that, given my first experience was so negative? But to sort of say, where else can we go? What else can we do to support that? And what other resources can we put in place to ensure that second conversation goes better? But also checking in with that first person you had the conversation with. What do you need to be able to have those conversations in a different way going forward?
Okay, thank you. And Kiersten?
Yeah, I mean, building right off of that, and I think Trudy answered that beautifully. I think that's always my going back to that earlier conversation, it's the receiving person. I mean, I definitely take an approach in this work that people are good, right? People are kind, people want to do good. and maybe just don't have the experience, the information, or whatever that looks like. So I think that that's important. The two things, it's kind of going back to the proactive thing. I mean, what we can do to address that is proactively be doing the trainings and the delivering the material and building the processes, because just doing that work and showing that commitment to it, if you're an HR person, a middle manager, a senior manager, whatever it looks like, the organization setting a tone with respect to how they want you to respond in that situation. So I think that's really important. If it's never talked about, and then you get blindsided as a leader with that conversation, it's a pretty challenging. And to Trudy's point, I totally agree. Is the person disclosing is also in an incredibly vulnerable position. So any discomfort or any reaction on the other side could be interpreted many different ways just because of the space there. And the second thing I would say, one thing that we try and kind of build in often is having, whatever it looks like in your organization, like an employee resource group or a Pride Alliance or whatever that looks like. When we build EDI strategies, we always encourage organizations to create 5 positions, say that are your EDI advocates in the organization, especially if the organization's spread out over different offices or whatever. And we'll use the analogy of say there's 5 people. The organization makes a commitment to make sure those 5 people are trained and have the resources, have the information, and are clearly identified in the organization, so that person who needs to come out has that little bit of a soft step before they talk to their boss, before they talk to their HR person. It goes back to that trauma-informed approach and really giving individuals their own agency, letting them self-declare or build their own, quote unquote, transition team in the organization and what that looks like. So those are some things I think we can do. Is it's going back to that theme of we need to support leaders in HR and employees as much as we support the transitioning individuals.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're coming to near the end of our time together. I would really love to thank our speakers, Kiersten, Mohr, and Trudy, Nicolle, for all of your insights, your sharing, your observation on this really important topic. I know we've had a number of people saying they need to sneak out and saying their thanks or adding their comments in the chat. So I know it's been widely appreciated. If you enjoyed this lecture, I'm going to ask people to keep an eye on the JSGS events calendar. We've got upcoming events and programs, including other sections of this EDI lecture series. Karen's going to share the link to our calendar in the chat. And now I'll ask you to join me for a round of applause for our speakers using the Zoom reactions option. I mean, if you want to put on your audio or your video and just clap as well, we certainly also support good old-fashioned clapping too. But thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again to our speakers, and have a wonderful afternoon.